Hi, it's Dwyer, dwyercrime.blog. It is November 12th, 2025. Let's talk about what I consider to be a huge miscarriage of justice. But first, let me preface this by saying I believe there are an entire group of cases where you look at the defendant and you think to yourself, this guy had motive to do the crime. Certainly, if I was in this guy's position, I would have been emotional. Not necessarily inclined to do a crime, but I could imagine the situation would be overpowering, right? The problem is that in those cases where you think that the defendant might have done the crime, the prosecution still has to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. Right? Which one of us is a model citizen? Which one of us is ready for the priesthood? People have flaws, right? So you can't judge a case solely by the motive. You actually need evidence. Nor can you judge a case solely by the victim. The victim may have come from a loving family. The victim may have had admirers. The people who knew the victim might have thought of him as a great person. The victim might even be more popular with the accused wife than the accused is. Folks, that's not enough to convict. So these TV shows, I'm a big fan of Dateline. I'm a big fan of 48 Hours, so much so that they, in part, inspired me to do Dwyer Crime. Right? I love crime shows. Often they involve crimes I'd never heard about. I love, seeing the personalities, hearing about the dynamics, hearing what the accused did to cover up their tracks. Now, there's a very well-made series. It's extremely well-made on HBO Max right now. It's called Tech Bros. And what they've done is they've focused on the tech industry, the state of California, right? People involved in a very wealthy part of the country that's often overlooked, Northern California, right? And they, in talking about wealth, money, they'll expose relationship problems that may have created a motive for someone to do a violent crime. On the show, the crime typically is murder. Now, folks, they have a Tech Bro episode on the Scott Davis case, right? The victim is a gentleman named David Coffin, right? Scott Davis's tie to Northern California is simply that after being suspected of committing this murder in Atlanta, he then left the state of Georgia over time, moved to Northern California, started a tech company. Then he made the mistake of running for governor of California, right? Him and half the state, quite frankly, right? This was when Gary Coleman ran to be governor, right? Gray Davis got recalled. A bunch of people ran. Scott Davis was one of them. And reporters then learned that Davis was once under suspicion in Georgia for the murder of David Coffin, whose family was worth millions of dollars, who was loved by many people. One of them apparently was Scott Davis's estranged wife. Right? So understand the evidence that the prosecution had. Right? They didn't try Davis for years. The cold case squad then came in and tried Davis. Let's talk about the evidence. His estranged wife starts dating David Coffin. Scott wanted his wife back. He called her several times. Some of these calls were taped. He's begging her to come back. Coffin is then found shot to death in his burning home. 2 days after the fire, in a voluntary police interview, in other words, no subpoena, right? Scott Davis voluntarily is talking to the cops. Davis, according to Grok AI, asked if David Coffin was shot. Folks, he asked. Now, I point out where I got that information because I did not get it from the Tech Bros show on HBO Max. The way it's presented is that in this voluntary interview, Scott mentions that Coffin was shot, which was supposed to be information that the police had kept private from the public. Right? The public, as far as they knew, thought this was a death in a fire. Right? The house is burned up. They didn't know that the victim got shot and died in the burning house. Right? They didn't know this information. And so, just understand, the police, of course, a red light goes on. If you believe the cops, they're wondering how Scott Davis could have known that the murder victim was shot. Right? This is in a case where, if you believe Grok AI, and please use the service, Davis actually doesn't know. He asks. Now, let me just say that authorities didn't think they had enough to try him. But then, of course, he leaves. He goes to California. There's a hullabaloo in California because a gubernatorial candidate was once investigated for murder. So, of course, this story hits the paper. And that's when the cold case squad is formed, right? When there's an outcry in another state. And that's when they discover a new fact. Davis hired a PI to find out where the man involved with his estranged wife lived. Folks, that's the new fact. Right? Some guy whose estranged wife was involved with another guy wanted to know where that other guy lived, who that other guy was. Right now, folks, the cops admit, they admit that they have no witnesses that have this guy, Scott Davis, over at Coffin's house, setting the house on fire. They have no witnesses that have Davis arguing with Coffin. None. There's no link between Davis and the gun found at the murder scene. There's no forensics that show that Scott Davis's clothes were at a fire scene. Right? It'd be powerful if they were able to say, hey, look at this shirt. This shirt has smoke residue on it. Right? This shirt has fibers from the murder victim's house on it. Folks, there's nothing like that. There's no film of him buying, arson materials. Nothing. But yet, based on the fact that Davis actually hired a PI 2 days before the fire to find out where Coffin lived, apparently that was enough for the cold case squad to get the warrant for his arrest. And for Scott Davis, again in a case with no witnesses who see him at the house, arguing with the victim, lighting the house on fire, without any forensics. I would argue without anything. Scott Davis was convicted of murder. Now we need to separate these great TV shows from the criminal justice system. On the show, they show, the murder victim's multimillionaire father. And they point out that this father wanted justice for his son. Right, folks, understand that's not the legal standard. Right, we understand that people get killed, the family suspects someone. Right, the family wants to make sure someone is held accountable. Right, jury instructions don't tell the jury, look, this guy came from a good family. People were concerned about the murder victim. You should consider that in determining guilt. To determine guilt, you actually need some evidence, don't you? Don't you need to make the argument that the accused had access to the murder weapon? That somebody saw some part of the accused, right? Maybe his car. Maybe he left something at the murder scene. Maybe he was seen buying an outfit that someone who didn't get a good view saw the intruder wear around the time the house was set on fire. Folks, the cops have nothing like that. I mean, nothing like that. And yet the narrator for this episode, right, is basically saying that, Scott Davis thought he was better than everyone else, and that Scott Davis thought he could get away with murder, right? And you have them interviewing a cop who talks about how Scott Davis was chatty when he met with police, voluntarily. Right now, folks, let me just say this politely. If someone gets killed and the cops call me and say, hey, we want to talk to you about this, and I go in and I'm, being questioned and I know nothing about it, right? I might know that, the guy who got killed was involved with my wife. Maybe that's why they're talking to me. But I have no idea how the guy got killed. Right? Let's say, other than the fact that he died in a fire. So you're sitting there, you're talking with law enforcement, and then the questions take a certain turn, and, you think you're in the clear because you're thinking, gee, I didn't start a fire. How many of us would know how to burn down a house? Right? I didn't buy any accelerants. Right? So you're sitting there thinking, hey, I'm covered because if this guy died in a fire, I'm not responsible. Right? A reasonable person wouldn't even look at me. And then the questions take a turn and you're thinking, wow, did this guy die another way? So you ask the question, was this guy shot? Folks, how inculpatory is that? I would say not at all. The guy's there voluntarily. He asks if the victim got shot because clearly if the victim died in a fire, then the guy has to be sitting there the whole time wondering, why are they looking at me? Right? Let me say too, We can't even place Scott at the scene. No one knows how he is supposed to have gotten there. Isn't that narrative supposed to be established beyond a reasonable doubt by the prosecution? You're a juror. You're supposed to hear that Scott asked about a gun. Scott hired a PI to find out where the guy involved with his wife was living. Right, folks? I believe many people hire PIs for similar reasons. Right? Aren't there shows on TV right now? Cheaters and shows like that where people, for whatever reason, suspect that their spouse is cheating on them, and they'll have their spouse followed. If they hear that the spouse is involved with someone, they'll want to find out who that person is. Folks, there are cases in which those things happen where no one's killing anyone. Look at all these cheater shows on television. So, folks, this case has no evidence, none, to support a murder conviction. And I mean none. No forensic evidence, no eyewitness evidence. They're calling it a circumstantial case. Folks, they don't even have that. No one can place Scott Davis at the murder scene at the time of the murder. So what's the circumstantial evidence that I'm supposed to rely on for a murder conviction? Please don't tell me it's that he hired a detective to figure out who was involved with his wife. Right? Folks, this is ludicrous. You know, I'm astonished, quite frankly, that the state of Georgia even felt a need to bring this case. It's even more appalling when you realize they didn't bring the case until reporters in the state of California found out that the guy running for governor had been investigated for murder. Right, so folks, you know, either we have a legal standard or we don't. If it's proof beyond a reasonable doubt, you need a hell of a lot more evidence than this case has. Right, folks, they don't even have any clothes that smell like smoke on Scott Davis. If Scott Davis took the stand, one wonders what he would testify about. Right? You know, it's an appalling case. You know, let me say, too, there's a human side to these murders. I appreciate when they show the family. But let's be clear here. Scott Davis's wife has no idea who killed David Coffin. She wasn't there. Let's be clear here, too. David Coffin's family has no idea who killed David Coffin. They weren't there. Dare I say the show Tech Bros. They have no idea who killed David Coffin. As I sit here, I have no idea who killed David Coffin. I can tell you with certainty that, you know, a spouse who wants his wife back certainly has a motive for murder. Right? But folks, a motive is not the same as meeting your burden of proof, is it? If it was, any time the guy a wife leaves you for is found dead, countless husbands would be automatically locked up and convicted. Let's thank the Constitution that that's not the way our criminal justice system operates, except in outlier unfair cases like this one. those are my thoughts. Let me hear yours. I know Scott Davis was a cause celeb for many people. I understand, people view him as having been a controlling husband, and, his behavior wasn't the best, right? I understand the case has other facts. He called the cops, claimed he was shot at, in some independent evidence. Folks, situation, I don't see where that's relevant. I really don't, right? Let me also point out, too, the prosecution had a theory that I believe is completely unproven, right? The claim is that Scott Davis went over to Coffin's house the day before his body was found, shot and killed him, then came back the next day and doused the place and lit it on fire. On what do they base that? Folks, they don't have a single witness. They don't have any clothes that he was alleged to have worn. Nobody saw any part of him, right? His car, anything like that, at the murder scene. Right, folks? The prosecution had to be inventive. Because if you believe that Scott Davis went over there and got into a tussle with a guy who he thought was sleeping with his estranged wife, and then Scott shot him, right, out of some rage. And again, no link between Scott and the murder weapon, right? But if they believe that, then it's a stretch to believe that in that moment, Scott happened to have the equipment with him, the materials with him to burn down the house. In other words, the whole thing doesn't work. If it was an argument that led to an unexpected shooting in the heat of the moment, then how does the killer have the wherewithal to burn down the house? Let me add, too, that, there are many other loose threads here. His wife, Megan, had a problem with some other guy who was violent toward her. Understand, Coffin, multimillionaire, investor, involved in many businesses, we don't know his life. We don't know if there wasn't someone from some business who he invested in who was threatened by him, was engaged in illegal activity that Coffin found out about. We don't know his business dealings. We don't know all the people who could be involved in this. Now, the public is fixated on adultery, ex-husbands, right? It's just fixated, right? These cases happen, and one of the first questions asked is, was anyone having an affair? Right? We understand that in a high percentage of these cases, when someone gets killed, often the killer is a loved one. So, of course, we extrapolate that. Right here, it's the guy who supposedly was involved with the loved one. Right, folks, I'll just say, someone at the DA's office got inventive and realized that the facts didn't make sense. That the idea of Scott Davis confronting Coffin, having a struggle with him, some kind of fight, shooting him to death, and then, by chance, having materials with him to burn down the house, somebody figured out that that wasn't believable. So without any evidence whatsoever, no forensics, nothing like that, they came up with the inventive tale that Davis leaves the house, then comes back with arson materials to burn it down the next day. Right, folks? No evidence should have led to no conviction. The fact that Davis ran for the governor of California is really just a backstory that has no relevance to this crime. The fact that the state of Georgia didn't think it had enough evidence to prosecute Scott Davis shows you that they didn't have enough evidence to prosecute him. This extra piece of evidence that he hired a detective to find out where Coffin lived is marginal at best. That doesn't show guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Right? No photos, no witnesses, no forensic evidence. Folks, in my opinion, no case. Let me hear from you in the comments section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.